If they put me and Oscar together, we're going to get ourselves killed. That's what one of the pilots said just days before he flew with Oscar, and they crashed into an apartment building, killing everyone on board the plane instantly. But this isn't just another story about a pilot's reckless mistakes. It's about the shocking details uncovered in the investigation that led to this tragedy. This is how everyone's reckless mistakes got 9 people killed. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. This story ended in a tragedy, but it began with the victims. 7 passengers and 2 pilots boarded a flight having no idea it would be their last. All 7 of the passengers were associates of a Florida real estate investment company taking part in a multi-city trip to look at potential shopping centers to purchase. The victims included Diane, Jared, Ori, Thomas, Gary, Diana, and Nick. And my heart goes out to their families that they left behind. This wasn't what they signed up for. When they boarded the plane, they trusted the private charter company, and they trusted the pilots flying the plane. Oscar, the captain, was 40 years old, sitting in the left seat. He was a foreign national from Colombia, and he got his private pilot certificate in 2003, his commercial rating in 2005, and eventually his airline transport pilot certificate in 2011. He flew for a few different companies in Colombia until he was hired in the United States as a Hawker 800 captain in May of 2014. 1 month later, he was involved in an FAA enforcement action for flying an aircraft contrary to air traffic control instructions. He completed remedial training, and the matter was closed in December 2014. A few months after that, Oscar's employment was terminated in April after he failed to show up for a training event. It turned out that he probably skipped training because he had a new job offer, and he was officially hired by a company called Execuflight in June of 2015 to serve as a captain on a Hawker 700 aircraft. Now, he finished that training and completed his check ride with the company in August, just 3 months prior to the tragedy. At the time of the crash, Oscar had about 6,100 hours of total flight time, including over 3,400 hours as pilot in command. He also had over 1,000 hours of flight time in the Hawker 700 and 800 series of aircraft, with over 600 hours as captain. That meant on paper he appeared to be well qualified for the job, and there wasn't anything abnormal about his training that raised any red flags. Sitting next to him in the right seat was Renato, a 50-year-old first officer from Italy. Renato was also a foreign national who got his private pilot certificate in 1990 and his commercial license in 1991. He would go on to serve in the Italian Air Force and eventually got his airline transport pilot certificate in 2007, and then he spent about 7 years flying the Hawker and Learjet aircraft. In September of 2014, he was hired by a company called Sky King to work as a first officer on the Boeing 737, but that didn't last very long. According to the company, he started to fall behind. He didn't know memory items, call-outs, profiles, or flows. They tried to help him, and they gave him 7 days of flying as a jump seater with over 16 hours observing flights, but his performance remained significantly below standards, and eventually he was fired in February of 2015. Just a few months later, Renato was hired by Execuflight, and what's crazy about all of this is that Sky King reported all of his struggles to Execuflight. In fact, a Sky King check airman wrote a letter saying that Renato's performance was ridiculously weak, but no one from Execuflight followed up to find out more. Regardless, Renato completed his training with Execuflight without further incident, and he passed his check ride in the Hawker aircraft in July of 2015, and at the time of the crash, he had over 4,300 hours of total flight time, with 3,200 hours as pilot in command. He also had about 480 hours of flight time in the Hawker 700 and 800 series of aircraft. Now, the most important thing you need to know about these 2 pilots is that the accident flight wasn't the first time they had flown together. In fact, Oscar and Renato had been paired together on 3 separate trips in the 90 days before the crash. However, the most shocking part about that was several days before the crash, Renato confided in another captain that he flew with, saying, "If they put me and Oscar together, we're going to get ourselves killed. Between the 2 of us, we know half of what you know." Tragically, he had no idea how right he was going to be, and the worst part was that he never voiced any of his concerns to the company, but you're about to find out why. Oscar and Renato worked for Execuflight, a Part 135 private charter company that was based out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. During the course of the investigation, the NTSB determined that Execuflight didn't have a safety management system, an aviation safety action program, or a non-punitive company reporting system. Basically, any complaints were supposed to be taken direct to the company management, something that I'd argue is very unlikely to happen when you're talking about a new hire pilot, and my guess is that's probably why Renato never raised any concerns about flying with Oscar. One of the other issues the NTSB highlighted was that at the time of the crash, Execuflight didn't have a director of operations. The previous director left the company in February of 2015, about 9 months before the crash. The reason this was an issue is because that position was required to be filled for flight operations conducted under Part 135. Additionally, even though it technically wasn't required, it's not clear if Execuflight had a director of safety because the company president said the chief pilot filled that role. However, the chief pilot told the NTSB that the company didn't have a director of safety. When it came to flight operations, the company had employees called dispatchers, but their job was to act as sales agents to arrange the charter flights, and they didn't perform typical dispatch functions such as pre-flight planning, filing flight plans, obtaining weather information, or calculating weight and balance. That being said, the way they typically tracked aircraft was through text messages from pilots instead of a formal flight following program. Another issue that the NTSB discovered was that the company's scheduling software would overwrite the original trips if any changes were made. The reason this is important is because there wasn't an audit trail to verify the trip information, nor any sort of formal process to ensure that pilots met the FAA rest requirements for each trip. In fact, when the company president was asked how they track duty time for pilots, he said that each pilot keeps their own duty time because it's a personal thing. You're going to see why this is a problem in a minute, but for right now, there are a few other issues with the company that you need to know about. First of all, there wasn't any clear guidance from the company on when first officers were allowed to fly. According to the investigation, Execuflight had an informal policy that the captain would always be the pilot flying when they had passengers on board, and first officers would fly the empty legs. But the former director of operations said that that was just a safety proposal in place, and the truth is that it was considered on a case-by-case basis. That's probably one of the reasons why Renato was the pilot flying at the time of the crash, and no one at the company knew about it or approved him to do so. The second issue had to do with the company's CRM training, which consisted of a lecture and a PowerPoint presentation, followed by a 10-question test. It turned out that Oscar's test had 100% written in the box for an uncorrected grade, with the chief pilot's initials next to it. However, he actually got 6 questions wrong, and his grade should have been 40%. These weren't tough questions either. One of the questions he missed was, which of the following is not a source of distraction? The correct answer is flying the airplane, but Oscar said the answer was C, completing paperwork in the cockpit. When it comes to Renato, his test showed 80% for his uncorrected grade and 100% for corrected, again with the chief pilot's initials next to it. However, the truth is he got a 70%, and his corrected grade should have been 90%, meaning he still didn't get them all right even after reviewing his mistakes. The biggest areas they struggled in were the responsibilities of the pilot in command, flight deck management, and aeronautical decision-making, 3 areas that would play a large role in the crash. Now, I could go on with more details, including some pretty shocking allegations that were made during a formal deposition of a captain that worked for the company. However, I'll just quote from the NTSB report where they said, "The investigation found that Execuflight had a casual attitude towards standards and compliance. The repeated deviations from sound operational practices identified in this investigation indicated a culture of complacency and disregard for rules." Oh, and if you're wondering about FAA oversight and how something like this could even happen, the NTSB said that contributing to the accident was the FAA's insufficient oversight. Due to funding limitations, the inspector assigned to Execuflight never visited Execuflight's training and wasn't aware that an audit was 1 year overdue. Despite the deficiencies identified in the investigation, the inspector told the NTSB that Execuflight was a very good operator. Now that you understand more about the company, we need to talk about what happened to Renato in the days before the crash. Alright, I want to take a quick break to tell you about an app on my phone that I've been using a lot lately. It's called Upside. Now, if you're like me, you're already filling up your gas tank, grabbing groceries, and going out to eat. These are purchases that you're already making anyway. Upside gives you the power to earn real cash back on all of that. I started using Upside a long time ago. Mainly it was for gas at first, and now it's automatic for me. Before I fuel up, I open up the app, I claim an offer at a station nearby, I pay with my card like usual, and boom, earnings show up in the app. No confusing points or rewards, just actual money that you can send straight to your bank or PayPal. And what's great is that it works at over 100,000 gas stations, grocery stores, and restaurants, and that means I can use it at places all across the country whenever I'm traveling. Oh, and you might not realize it, but Upside users earn about 3 times more cash back with Upside compared to loyalty programs or credit card rewards. In fact, over $1 million in cash back is earned by users every single week. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description below to download Upside and use the code PILOT to get an extra 25 cents back per gallon on your first tank of gas, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen here to grab that offer. And now let's get back to the debrief. Remember earlier when I told you that it was up to each pilot to track their duty time to determine if they were legal for each flight? Well, the thing is, the FAA requires pilots to have at least 10 consecutive hours of rest in the 24 hours before the planned completion of their trip. The NTSB always looks at a pilot's history when they have a mishap like this, and they found out that on November 7th, 3 days before the crash, Renato left his hotel at 12:10 p.m. to head to the airport. He started doing the aircraft pre-flight between 2 and 2:30, and a text message sent to dispatch said that the cabin doors were closed at 4:53 and they took off at 5:20 for a flight from Teterboro to Fort Lauderdale. They arrived around 8 p.m., and that's when Renato was met by the chief pilot, who told him that he needed to fly down to Mexico. The captain that Renato was with claimed that he told the dispatcher that they couldn't fly the trip because it would put them over the duty limits, but they sent Renato anyways, flying with the chief pilot, and they took off just 34 minutes later. Renato landed in Mexico around 1 a.m. and he thought he was done, but then he was told that he needed to fly back to Fort Lauderdale. Even though he was exhausted and hadn't prepared to fly all night, that's exactly what he did, and they eventually landed around 7:15 in the morning. That meant he had only 7 hours and 45 minutes of rest instead of the 10 hours required, and the flight back from Mexico was illegal. Now, if you're wondering what this has to do with the crash, well, here's the deal. First of all, it was just more evidence of a company culture that had a casual attitude towards standards and compliance, but more importantly, it meant that Renato was most likely fatigued when he began the accident flight. That's because he got back to Fort Lauderdale on November 8th at 7:15 a.m., and even though he had a chance to sleep during the day, he went back to work on November 9th from 5:50 a.m. until 8:30 p.m. for a total of 14 hours and 40 minutes, and that was the day before the crash. But now that we've talked about all the factors leading up to this incident, we need to see what happened during the flight. The accident flight was the second flight of the day for Oscar and Renato. This should have been an easy routine flight from Montgomery, Alabama to Akron, Ohio, and they filed an IFR flight plan to cruise at 17,000 feet for the 34-minute flight. The aircraft they were flying was a 1979 Hawker 700, and according to the investigation, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. One of the details about the aircraft worth mentioning is that Oscar and Renato did their weight and balance calculation wrong, and they were about 600 pounds below the correct weight of the aircraft. This meant that even though they were within the weight and balance limit for takeoff, if they had actually made it to their destination, they would have been about 286 pounds over the maximum landing weight for the aircraft. Regardless, shortly after they arrived at the airport around 9:30 a.m., they checked the weather, but the problem was that the Akron airport doesn't have a terminal area forecast known as a TAF. Instead, the closest TAF was at a regional airport 8 miles to the south. Either way, that forecast was calling for overcast ceilings at 700 feet and 4 miles visibility with light drizzle, and all the nearby airports were also reporting IMC weather with ceilings less than 1,000 feet. Oscar and Renato planned for a 1:30 p.m. takeoff time, but due to minor delays, they texted the company that the doors were closed at 1:49, and they called flight service at 2 p.m. to get their IFR clearance. Unfortunately, they didn't ask for any updates on the weather. If they did, they would have discovered that things were getting worse, and the destination area forecast was now calling for 400-foot ceilings with 3 miles visibility. And to be honest, I just don't understand how pilots can plan a flight and not get an update on the destination weather before they take off, especially when they know the weather isn't that great. Now, maybe it's just me, but I want to know if I can land when I get to my destination. Plus, the weather was bad enough that they were required to file an alternate airport, which is something that they didn't do. This was going to be a short flight, so a few minutes after they got airborne, they tuned the radio to get the current weather observation at Akron. Things looked pretty good with broken clouds at 1,100 feet and 10 miles visibility. The only problem was that they had tuned the radio to the wrong frequency, and this was the weather for a different airport about 100 miles away from Akron. A few minutes later, Renato was flying the plane and he asked Oscar to brief him on the approach. Now, just to be clear about this, typically the pilot flying is the one responsible for briefing the approach because you're going to be the one flying the approach, and briefing it gives you a chance to review anything that you're not certain about, and it also reinforces all of the approach requirements and procedures. Oscar should have known this, and he should have said, "Why don't I take the aircraft for a minute and you can review and brief me on the approach?" Instead, he just said, "Okay, we got the weather, overcast, so we're going to be runway 20. And then a few seconds later, he said, "Localizer runway 2, that's what the briefing is." Maybe the transmissions were cut off on the CVR, but what you need to know is that there were only 2 approaches available based on the winds at Akron, and they were the localizer or the RNAV GPS approach to runway 25, not runway 20 and not runway 2. Oscar continued to fumble for another minute, and then the controller cleared them to cross the Hoover intersection at 9,000 feet. At that point, they were at 17,000 feet and about 50 miles from Hoover, so they had less than 10 minutes to figure things out. As they were trying to do that, one of the passengers came up to the cockpit joking around, asking the pilots if they knew where they were going. Renato said he could stay for a few minutes, but then he had to go because they can't be distracted. And I'm glad he said that because this is where things started to fall apart. They still hadn't finished an approach briefing, so Renato said, "Okay, so we go down to 23, then down to what's the minimums?" And Oscar responded, 473, but let's round it up to 480. Just for reference, here's a copy of the approach chart they were using showing that the 2,300 feet that Renato was talking about was the minimum altitude at the final approach fix, but 473 isn't an altitude, it's a height above touchdown. The minimum descent altitude is 1,540 feet MSL. This would turn out to be a huge source of confusion for the rest of the flight, and the reason why you can't get these mixed up is because the field elevation is about 1,000 feet above sea level, so if you try to descend to 473 feet MSL, you're going to dive straight into the ground. If that mistake wasn't bad enough, about a minute later, Renato said, "The minima for this approach is 1520, unless you are high, then it's 1560. And then he made a comment about the ground being 501. If that sounds confusing, it should be. That's because it turned out Renato was looking at the minimums on the RNAV GPS approach for runway 25, while Oscar was looking at the localizer approach. So they weren't even on the same page, literally and figuratively. As they continued their descent through 10,000 feet, they were doing 298 knots, almost 50 knots over the legal limit, but no one seemed to notice and they were falling further behind the aircraft. They eventually realized that they had the wrong radio frequency for the Akron weather, so they fixed that and they discovered it was overcast at 600 feet and the visibility was 1.5 miles. That just so happened to be about the same time they were passing over Hoover and checking in with the approach controller.
Good afternoon, Zipline 1521. We are 9,000 over Hoover.
Zipline 1526, flighting 065, vector localizer 25, final approach course Akron Fulton, advise when you have their weather.
Very well, sir. Heading 065 for now. We are in the process of copying the weather, maintaining 9,000, zipline 1526.
Zipline 1526, descend upon discretion, maintain 5,000.
PD 5,000, 1526, roger.
Now they were cleared down to 5,000 feet and they spent the next 3 minutes debating if they were even legal to do the approach based on the weather conditions. And at one point, Oscar even said, "Did you do my approach brief? We got to go somewhere else, right? I might be wrong. I'm not sure. I might be wrong." They spent another minute trying to figure out if they were doing the RNAV or the localizer approach, even though the controller had already told them they were on vectors for the localizer approach. Oscar said again that the minimums are 480, and Renato asked him if he's sure, and then 10 seconds later, Oscar said it's 1,500, but that wasn't right either.
And Zipline 1526, do have another aircraft that's inbound to the airport that's slower than you. Fly heading 360, and a reduced speed of 170, then descend and maintain 3,000.
Down to 3,000, 170 on the speed and heading 360, zipline 1526.
Next, there was more confusion about how to set up the nav aids for the approach because the final approach fix is an NDB. Once again, this was all stuff that should have been talked about while they were on the ground in Montgomery, or at the latest about 10 minutes ago when they did an approach briefing. Either way, this would have been the perfect time for them to ask the controller for delay vectors or maybe a turn and a holding pattern because they weren't ready for the approach. Instead, they were given a turn to intercept the localizer, and as they made that turn, they had about 5 minutes left to live. They intercepted the localizer at 3,000 feet, and Renato began slowing down and configuring the aircraft for landing. A few seconds later, Oscar said, "Oh, we got 9 degrees pitch up," referring to the fact that Renato is flying with a high pitch attitude. They were eventually cleared for the approach, and as their airspeed continued to decrease from 150 down to 125 knots, the pitch attitude increased from 5 degrees to 12 degrees nose high. Instead of taking over the controls, Oscar tried to warn Renato, saying, "Look, you're going 120. You can't keep decreasing your speed." He tried to say they needed to be at VREF plus 15 knots, but here's what you need to know. VREF is your reference speed for landing, and in this case, Oscar calculated it to be 124 knots, even though it should have been 125 or 126 knots based on their weight. Either way, according to the company procedures, they're supposed to fly the approach at VREF plus 20 knots, not VREF plus 15. And that meant they should have been doing about 145 knots right now, but instead they were going 120. Oscar tried to explain, saying, "We're going to stall. I don't want to stall." And as the pilot in command, he should have called for the go-around and taken over as the pilot flying. Instead, they continued the approach. Keep in mind that they were at 3,000 feet when they intercepted the localizer, and they should have descended to 2,300 feet, but they were so distracted by their airspeeds and lack of awareness that they started their descent very late, and they were about 400 feet high when they crossed the final approach fix. That's when Renato said they were 4 miles out, and he called for full flaps. This was another huge mistake because according to their training, they aren't supposed to lower the flaps to 45 until landing is assured. The reason you don't lower them to 45 early is because it's a lot of drag and you risk getting too slow with a very high pitch angle. That's why Oscar should have said no, stand by on the flaps. But he didn't, and they lowered the flaps to 45. Renato said, "All right, we go to minimums," but I don't think they really understood what minimums they were descending to. A few seconds later, Oscar said, you're diving, don't dive, 2,000 feet per minute, buddy." Then a few seconds later, 2,000 feet per minute, don't do 2,000 feet per minute. And then again 5 seconds later, don't do 2,000 feet per minute when you're 1,500 feet above the ground or minimums. At this point, they were only about 1,000 feet above the ground, and based on their rate of descent, they had about 30 seconds left to live. Once again, instead of going around, Oscar just said, "Keep going." He eventually told Renato to level off, likely as they were approaching 1,500 feet MSL, and Renato pulled back on the controls, but he had allowed the aircraft to get too slow with the power pulled back during the descent. In fact, the NTSB determined that when radar contact was lost at 1,300 feet MSL, or about 200 feet above the ground, they were likely doing 98 knots, which was 27 knots below VREF. The stick shaker activated, warning them they were about to stall, but it was too late as Renato pulled back on the controls and their angle of attack increased to about 21 degrees or almost 6 degrees beyond the critical angle of attack, and they stalled, crashing into an apartment building in the embankment just beyond, killing everyone on board instantly. 9 lives were lost in this deadly tragedy, and the NTSB said the probable cause was the flight crew's mismanagement of the approach and multiple deviations from company procedures. However, they also placed some of the blame on the company for its casual attitude towards compliance and the FAA for their insufficient oversight. That being said, I'd argue that everyone's reckless mistakes are what got 9 people killed in this disaster. Oscar was the pilot in command, so it was his job to ensure the safety of the flight, and he failed to do so. Renato had enough experience as a pilot to speak up, and he could have made better decisions. However, the company culture and the lack of FAA oversight created an environment where all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up that allowed this to happen, and my only hope is that this debrief helps prevent future mistakes like this from being made. Thank you so much for your support, especially those of you on Patreon that help make all of this content possible. Be sure to check out one of these other videos on the screen, and I'll see you on the next debrief.